Other than that, I've always got a bunch of things going on. A lot of spinning plates, which actually, you know, little trivia here. I actually know how to spin plates because I had to take a clown class when I went to theater school. So
Awesome.
just in case I'm at your party and things are getting dull, I can spin plates. I can also ride a unicycle.
I was literally about to ask, do
Wow.
you unicycle too? Because that like I know that usually do you do them at the same time?
Oh no, I think that was like the level above me. I can't quite do that, but I can spin some plates and then I can jump on a unicycle.
That was the next level class. That was
Yeah, exactly. I didn't quite get there. I didn't graduate to that level.
Let's see. So we have here a couple days ago, I was perusing Twitter and I saw this tweet and it said a thread on Swedengate from a white Swede who is surprised that people are surprised that there's racism in Sweden. Of course, there's racism in Sweden. At what point did people think that the U.S. held the monopoly on racism? And I thought that was very interesting because usually in a lot of discourse, and especially when we're growing up and we're going to school here, we, especially like World War II and things like that, we generally don't really learn that much about Sweden. But when we do learn about Sweden, we usually just learn that they're just like neutral in this super peaceful country. So I thought that went against the general, the usual narrative. So I wanted you to come in and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I actually didn't even know. I'm not on the Twitter sphere that often, but a couple of friends
Smart.
reached out to me and they were like, "What do you have to say about Swedengate?" I'm like, "The what now?" I felt like, like the little old lady, like, "What's happening on the interwebs?" But so I still don't really know how it popped off, but I understand that people were shocked that Sweden was racist, and I was like, I feel like at this point we should just accept that racism, like sexism, like colonialism, like capitalism, doesn't have any borders. These are concepts that have flooded throughout the world, and that sucks. But let's not make it sound like somehow that all just got funneled into the United States. Like, that's ridiculous. And actually, I can definitely recommend. James Baldwin wrote about this as well because he lived for a time in France, and I believe Ta-Nehisi Coates also wrote about it because he too went to France, kind of seeking that sort of that anti-racist utopia a bit as well, and it doesn't exist. And I think that Sweden has a really good PR campaign, like way better than the U.S. And so Sweden presents itself as this very progressive country. And I mean, in some ways it is, right? Like, there are, when you compare it to the US, which I pointed out in this tweet thread, that's a really low bar. Like, we can't compare countries to the US and be like, well, they're really progressive. Well, so are a lot of dictatorships. Like, this shouldn't be our threshold for whether a society is egalitarian or just. And so I think it's important to highlight that particularly any European nation has a really horrific past when it comes to racism and colonialism and imperialism. And even though Sweden personally never had colonies in Africa, was super gung-ho about the colonization of Africa, which in turn, as a Swedish writer, went on to highlight in his book "Exterminate All the Brutes," which I recommend to folks. His name is Sven Lindqvist, and he wrote that Sweden did not have a colony, but hosted, the Belgians who took over what we now know of as the Congo, and just loved what was going on down there, and just was super, was applauding this push of colonialism in Africa, and so the idea that Sweden was then neutral, or has at any point really been neutral, is ridiculous, because as many people have pointed out, you can't be neutral when there's this horrific oppression of human beings going on. There's no such thing as being neutral. As Chris Hedges points out, you're either with all of the oppressed or you're with none. And historically, Sweden has been on the side of the oppressor, if only because, for instance, in World War II, it wanted to be neutral. Well, how can you be neutral at a time when people are literally experiencing genocide? You can't be. And, you know, it's kind of like the saying, if there's a guy at a table with 10 Nazis, there's really 11 Nazis at that table, right? Like, so you are the company that you keep. And Sweden, during World War II, there was a lot of Nazi sympathizing that happened in Sweden. Yes, there was also some underground support, particularly that was going across the border into Norway and into Denmark to support the resistance. So I'm not trying to say that all Swedes are Nazis or anything, but there was a lot of support. Just like you saw in the US, you know, Madison Square Garden was filled with Nazis. I believe it was 1939. They had a giant swastika next to a picture of, or a painting of George Washington. And this filled Madison Square Garden. So the idea that, you know, racism is specific to the US or that Nazism is specific to Germany, it's like, these things don't understand borders. There are no borders when it comes to this, to these horrors. Likewise, there are no borders when it comes to building solidarity and resistance to these horrors. And so I think, you know, I mean, we can talk about more specifics, but Sweden has a very dark history with regards to white supremacy and with regards to colonialism, even when they weren't, you know, specifically, you know, personally colonizing Africa, for instance.
Yeah, that is exactly that is the like exact opposite of what you think most people think of when they think of Sweden. And I think like right before you got on, actually, we were talking about the fact that the PR campaign is crazy. For a lot, especially when you mentioned the Nazis in 1939, the rally they had in New York. And one of the things I want to point out is another PR campaign, the Hindenburg, the fact that it had swastikas all over it and it was just flying over New York. And then like no one even like talks about the fact that there was a giant Zeppelin with swastikas just flying over New York in right before World War II, I guess. But yeah, it's in those PR campaigns are insane. But yeah, if you want to go into a little bit about I want to talk about if you can go over the sterilization campaigns, the eugenics campaigns they're also in Sweden, just like the US. And
sure. So this is something that you don't really learn about in Swedish schools, kind of like when we talk about indigenous peoples in the US, we talk about people with buckles on their hats, and then there were people with feathers in their hair, and then they gave those people with the buckles on their hats corn and happy Thanksgiving. There isn't quite that ridiculous Disney version of the story in Sweden. It's just not really talked about. So if you think about like the map of Scandinavia, you've got Norway, Sweden, Finland, and then on next to Finland you have Russia, and really that top bit there is known as Sapmi, Sapmi, and it's the indigenous home of the Sami. And actually, excavations have shown that the Sami were actually indigenous to places much further south than where they are now, but that they were, you know, kind of pushed further north due to the foundings of these nation states. But that aside, basically the Sami are indigenous, and you know, there's a lot of questions that have been swirling around about what does indigenous mean, and I think most of the time when I talk about this, either with someone who's Sami or people or other people, a lot of people mention the UN Charter about this that describes that indigenous as somebody who is who has this place as a historical home who was then colonized. So I, for instance, am not indigenous, even though I can trace parts of my family back in the same part of Sweden for, you know, maybe 600, 700 years. I'm not indigenous because my ancestors were never colonized in that sense. So there's a specific aspect to that I think that it is important to highlight as well. And so the Sami were basically violently colonized, starting kind of when the nation state started to be created towards the end of what we consider the Viking era. the 1100s, the 1000s. Sweden came a little bit later, but basically the relationships that had been at times very, kind of equal in terms, like there's evidence to show that Vikings, so-called, I have an issue with that name, but whatever. The so-called Vikings and the Sami traded. The Samis were expert boat builders, so a lot of them were building boats that the Vikings then used. They married, and so that the chieftains of each of these various places could join forces. So there was that kind of relationship that then, when nation states became a much more, you have to pay homage to this king. You are now on Swedish land, and they're like, what the fuck is that? And that became much more violent, as you see, like the 1600s and the 1700s, when it became a sense of nationalism. This is when you see the rise of nationalism in the late 1700s, 1800s. This is when people started digging up Vikings and calling them like this national hero, when before they were just like, dead people in the fucking ground. And that meant that with the creation of nation states and this creation of national pride, you have to define who your people are, which means that you have to define who your people aren't. And this is why I have a problem with nation states in general, because there always has to be the other that doesn't belong. And the Sami were kind of a prime example of this. They were the others. And with the rise of eugenics that happened, of course, not just in Sweden, but all over the world, the Sami were used as this prime example, measuring the heads and showing how they were lesser than, or etc. And this then went, just as we've seen in other examples, this went on to forced sterilizations in the tens of thousands. And when you consider the population of a place like Sweden, that is roughly the size of California, and even today has fewer people than the city of New York, that's a huge chunk of human beings that you have basically just you've cut them out from perpetuating their people and their culture in that way. And Sweden actually created a Swedish Institute for Racial Biology, which was funded by the state, and it was only closed in 1958. So we, even as Americans, would think that's a little late because, yes, U.S. was doing really fucked up shit past 1958, but to have a federally funded institute that basically says these people are lesser than, that's even for U.S. standards, that's a little
next level.
And yet that was the reality in Sweden. And there's been a lot of researchers that have gone back and looked in these looked in the files of this institute and really just seen the horrific things that were done. And it wasn't just Sami, but I'm using that as the prime example because they were really the focal point of this campaign. But of course, it was white supremacy in general. So it was also that this went very much hand in hand with the rise of Nazism in the rest of the continent. So of course, Jews were part of this as well, and so I think like this is a very large part of Sweden's history that, of course, goes back to the founding of Sweden as a nation state. And culminates today with Sweden being one of the largest weapons exporters in the world. And I don't think people think about that. Like after the US, it might even be the largest. And so Sweden continues, obviously, to make money off of violent racism and colonialism because, of course, where do these weapons go? Predominantly to the bombing of Black and brown people around the world. So this is the idea that Sweden is somehow neutral, which you can't be if you're making bombs, or that Sweden is somehow not racist, is absurd. And I think that that just like in the U.S., there's a very dark history. There's a very dark systemic issue with racism that Sweden loves to point at the U.S. and be like, oh my God, that's terrible. Like every time a cop kills like a Black person, Sweden's like, oh my God, well, I never. And it's like, yeah, no, your cops don't kill people like that, but that doesn't mean that you don't have your own versions of this systemic racism. And I think that it's also important to recognize that systemic racism is not one thing, right? It is a variety of lived experiences. It is a variety of of horrors and tactics by the state to not only mete out this kind of violence, but also to cover it up in a variety of different PR campaigns. So, of course, Sweden has the ads with Black people and in particular Arabic people and Muslims because that looks good, right? But that is the shiny facade on a very, very dark history that continues to exist. It's a dark present, and particularly if you look at what's going on with Sapmi right now in the far north, Sweden is trying to build copper mines and trying to deforest large swaths of Sapmi land. So this colonization that we see in the United States, for instance, with like the Dakota Access Pipeline, for instance, cutting through indigenous I mean, it's all indigenous, but specifically even federally recognized indigenous territory, the same shit is happening in Sweden today, but nobody talks about it the same way. And you even have Swedes that went to Standing Rock, but won't go up north to their own country to support the Sami because it's really just not talked about. And it doesn't have the same Hollywood feel as helping the indigenous of the United States. And so these are issues that need to be brought up, not just in Sweden, but understood internationally as well, that yes, Sweden and Norway and Finland and parts of Russia have indigenous peoples that continue to suffer under the founding of the nation states of these countries.
Andrew, did you have anything you wanted to focus on?
Yeah, so going off of what you just said, that Sweden is one of the biggest weapons exporters in the world, right? I'm curious if you have a little bit more kind of like historical context of when did Sweden become that, and like how did that kind of come to be? Do you have? Yeah,
I don't actually have that information. This is just something that I found out, I think, kind of when I started working on the on the Iraq War, like right before the U.S. invaded Iraq for the second time in 2003. And I just remember reading something about like Sweden supports the U.S. and their allies, and I'm like, what's that mean? And
Wow.
it's this way of supporting without supporting, right? Because the state doesn't take an official stance like, hey, we're also invading Iraq, but there are Swedish soldiers who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, first of all. And then there are also a shit ton of weapons exports that have supported, U.S. imperialism. And of course, right now we're dealing with Sweden trying to join NATO. Sweden has supported NATO, again, without being an actual member.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is another thing. Sweden wants to go to the club, but like not be part of the club, like just in case, like it turns out that the club is like full of Nazis, and they can be like, I don't have a member card, so it's not.
They sit right by the entrance,
like an unofficial member.
Right. I was just passing by, actually. I don't even know. So it's like
plausible deniability for Sweden.
Right. They want to like have it both ways. And I mean, it's also kind of like a joke about Swedes, is that they want everything to be like, like the baby bear, like everything's just right. Like we don't want it too hot. We don't want it too cold. We don't want it too loud or too soft. It's like very typical, like the joke about Swedes. And so, like, Sweden's not been officially part of NATO, but they let NATO do a bunch of fucking military exercises in Sweden, in the far north, which is the closest part of Sweden to Russia. It's like, you're really just trying to, and they've supported NATO. So I think, like, Sweden has a rich history of trying to have it both ways. So with regards to the actual start of the military-industrial complex here, I can't tell you exactly when, but this is something that again goes back to the further parts of Sweden's history. I mean, Sweden had what we call here stormaktstid, which is like the big power era of Sweden, where Sweden was like trying to take over parts of Europe, and there was all of this basically like pissing contests going on between kings, and so Sweden has a long history of funneling money into the military, which is really just And that's not again, it's not singling Sweden out. This is Europe, right? Europe has a long history of spending money on weapons. And I mean, we might be able to trace it back to the late 1800s. I know that at that point, with the scramble for Africa, one of the things that Winston Churchill actually said, that was with the advent of long-range guns, it became sport to fire upon the indigenous peoples of Africa, and he kind of misses those days of that sport-like war, because it was fun. You could just sit on the boat and murder a bunch of people on land, and they had nothing to fire back at you with.
Totally normal ramblings of a human being. That's just
right.
Just passing the time.
And everybody loves Winston Churchill, right?
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I mean, exactly. And this is when the weapons industry in Europe really geared up, was because of the scramble for Africa. Needed a way to more easily take over people and torture and abuse, and the weapons industry was like, well, we got you. So I think, I don't know exactly like when specifically Sweden threw its hat in the ring, but in terms of the continent really going gung ho at that point, it was like the late 1800s, the mid to late 1800s.
I was watching something with Vijay Prashad. He was talking about the fact that they have the gun, the Stoger, that brand of gun is like a Swedish gun, and that is like supplied in the military, in militaries all across the world. And that's actually when I first started was like neutral. That doesn't seem really neutral to me.
Yeah, and I think like if you've ever seen a Saab commercial, which is a Swedish car, they've always got some bullshit. They're like born from jets. Yeah, military jets. Not like friendly, dropping food off for starving people. No, like the kind that bomb people, those kind of jets. And Sweden's like super proud of it. So yeah, I mean, it's really laughable and disgusting at the same time. And the neutral banner that Sweden really loves to fly is as blood-soaked as any other flag in Europe, I would say.
And can you tell us more about the far right organizing that happened in the anti-fascist, the imperialist, not the pro-imperialist organizing that went down there?
Sure. I mean, well, one thing that I like to highlight, which is like one of my favorite images ever. Folks might know it, but if you don't, just Google handbag lady Nazi Sweden, maybe. So there's an image of a little old lady with her handbag, and she's swinging it at a Nazi who's like at a protest or like at some kind of like fascist march in Sweden. And I love that so much, and I really am bummed that that our paths never crossed, that she was probably dead by the time I was born, because I would have loved to just like hang out with this lady and be like, so you were just walking along and then you were just like, fuck it, I'm gonna swing my handbag at a Nazi. So I mean, that's obviously just like one person, but it also shows that there is a lot of history of anti-fascist organizing. There's also, for instance, he's called like the Swedish Schindler, Raoul Wallenberg, who helped move many Jews from the continent to Sweden and elsewhere during the Holocaust. There's a lot of and during the Vietnam War, for instance, there was a lot of anti-Vietnam organizing. I actually just met someone the other day who helped organize some anti-US militarism marches back then. So there is this history of like, fuck militarism, fuck war. And I think that, I'm glad that you asked about that, because I think it's important to highlight that just like in the US, there's a lot of anti-racist, anti-war organizing that happens. And so to make that differentiation that the people are not necessarily the choices of their government. On the other hand, of course, there's a history of a lot of fascist organizing as well, and there are fascist marches here as well. I was at a counter protest to one a few years ago, and I mean it was kind of laughable because there were like 20 of them, and then there were like hundreds of the anti-fascist protesters, and the cops were literally, as they do, like protecting the fascists from the anti-fascists. But there's a party in Sweden that's basically a Nazi party. The Sweden Democrats, they're called, which I think is also kind of funny because they're called the Democrats, and I'm like, see what happens when you vote for the Democrats. So and they are basically they are basically very hard line, not even like sugarcoating a lot of it, saying that we should close the borders, and people that aren't of Swedish descent shouldn't have certain rights, and this kind of shit. And also, to the point, a friend of mine pointed this out because she had like read their party platform, because she was kind of like, who the fuck, what? And apparently it's so bad that they want to get rid of Arab horses, which are if people don't know, Arab horses are like they're the best. They're the ones that you like, train with, and that people spend $500,000 on and stuff like that. The Sweden Democrats want to get rid of the Arab horses and try to bring back the Nordic type of horses for racing. Now, if you've ever seen like an Icelandic horse or like a Nordic type horse, they're the kind that you put shit on and then you like go out into the mountains and like just use it as a beast of burden. You don't race it. It is not elegant. I'm sorry, no offense, but it's like, let me pull some shit for you to the market. It's not like an Arab horse where you're like, wow, that's like the black stallion from that, movie. And so it's like, it's to this point, and I mean, it's funny, but it's also like, wow, you are so fascist that you don't even want Arabic horses.
Like, that's extreme. That's fringe.
Yes, it's very, but like these people have seats in parliament. So, and of course they use the same language that we see the fascists or the far right in the US use. Oh, well, our country's going down the shitter, and it's because of, fill in the blank, immigrants. We need to do more about, we need to protect our women, and we need to protect our, all of this shit. Meanwhile, they don't ever make legislation to protect the elderly or to protect women or whatever. And so the far right has been gaining a lot of traction here, just like we see it in the rest of the world, because what happens when neoliberalism takes hold is that you basically are accelerating towards fascism. It's the path towards fascism. And that's definitely what you've seen here. Sweden has had a long history of just basically since Olof Palme was murdered. And I mean, he was a brilliant prime minister, very progressive, and he was murdered basically because of that. They still don't know who murdered him, but there's been a lot of conversations as to who it was and whether maybe the US was behind it. And so like, I think he was the first and perhaps the only head of state that went to Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro. And was really trying to institute a lot of radical, or at the time, radical, what we would just consider, like human rights and shit. Some radical legislation to support people. And since then, since the 60s and 70s, we've just seen like this neoliberalist push in Sweden where things have become privatized. For instance, the railways are now privatized, so trains are always fucking late. They're starting to privatize medicine, so there are now private hospitals that you can go to, which of course have a lot better service. But the public hospitals, if you can't afford the private ones, you might wait 2 years for an operation that you really need. But hey, you won't have to pay for it. So it's like, yes, we still have socialized healthcare here, but at what cost? There's been a lot of like corporate influence. So for instance, I mentioned deforestation is a big problem in Sweden. We pride ourselves on our beautiful forests, but we're fucking destroying them. We're also trying to, as I mentioned, build mines in the far north, which is, a dash of colonialism with a dash of destroying the planet. So Sweden has really done a great job of pushing this neoliberalist policy, which of course lays the groundwork for fascism to rise, to highlight all of the shit that's going wrong in this country, which is true, but then give the answer as basically saying that the poison is the answer and the antidote, as opposed to what we really need to do, which is move further left and find the roots that really did exist kind of in the early 1900s. You had a lot of people organizing around actual socialist ideals that, no, by the way, Sweden's not socialist, so please never refer to Sweden as socialist, because it's definitely not. It's very capitalist. It's just that we have a bit like tighter reins on the beast of capitalism than the US does, but so does like everybody. In the 1900s, there really was a lot of organizing, and people were getting these gains, making sure that they had healthcare, making sure that people didn't have to work themselves to death. People had lots of vacation time. People, which I mean they still do, but they're chipping away at these things, which is, as several writers have pointed out, the gravity of capitalism. And I think Richard Wolff has talked about this too. Like, no matter how many times you try to like polish and rein in capitalism, after a time, the gravity of capitalism will just tear away at those fetters that you have on it, and it will become that beast that either gives rise to a new system that is built on justice, or gives rise to fascism, and then we start this whole fucking thing over again. I think it's very frightening to see what's going on in Sweden, just like it's very frightening to see what's going on in the US. And I do feel that we really have to share ideas and tactics across borders, because the fascists, whether they're the fascists in government or the fascists, in the underground, so to speak, are doing that. They're sharing tactics. And, for instance, the mass shootings that happen in the US, you have fascists in Sweden applauding it. So I think that, these people are getting in touch with each other. The people who are anti-fascist, anti-war, anti-imperialism need to be doing the same.
I mean, you're right. Even in the manifestos, they reference the New Zealand Christchurch shooting. So the far right definitely has an international solidarity that's going on. The left needs to get on board with themselves. Andrew, do you have anything else you want to ask?
Yeah, so I mean, you started mentioning a little bit about NATO, and I know right now, there's this whole thing where Sweden might be joining NATO, and I was looking at different polls, and a lot of people living in Sweden seem to be for joining in NATO. So I was wondering if you could provide a little context as to why you think that might be, and sort of the relationship between Sweden and Russia that has kind of occurred, since they are pretty close to each other, and I know there's definitely a lot of dynamics there.
Sure. Like I tell people in the US, Sweden is like the OG enemy of Russia. They like to teach us in school that Sweden is the only country to ever take and hold Russia. And actually, like I think it's in St. Petersburg, there's a statue of Peter the Great squashing the Swedish snake because he expelled the Swedes. Yeah, like tit for tat bullshit between imperial powers. Who cares, right?
Whoa.
But yeah, so Sweden and Russia have a long-standing, like, hatred and kind of like bucking bronchos kind of relationship. And when I was growing up, I remember there would be like these comedy skits about how, somebody, like an old lady in the archipelago, which is right like by the Baltic, that I saw a Russian submarine. And it's like, it's become this joke that the Russians are always like sneaking around in our archipelago. And it's become a joke because it's like, no, they're fucking not. Okay. It's just, what are they here for? Like lingonberries? Like, there's no reason for them to fucking like Russia just, and this is the thing. It's like Russia is not an empire anymore. The US is an empire. And I have a lot of problems with Russia invading Ukraine. I don't think anybody should invade fucking anywhere. And I don't like Putin. And let's be honest, the US did like Putin. He was our guy in Russia. We loved the fact that he was so capitalist and that he was so cutthroat. We were like, yes, yeah, it's like God looking at man, like, oh, love it, love the look.
Look what I've made.
Look what I've done. Yeah. And then Putin was like, man, I don't want to fuck with y'all anymore. And then the US was like, okay, that's not cool. And so this is what, like, when NATO was created, there was a promise to Russia at the time. Look, we're not going to move further east. If you look at a map of where NATO started and where it is today, oh, that shit moved east hard, like a lot. And of course, now that, you know, the whole Ukraine thing was that the US wanted Ukraine to join NATO, and Russia was basically like, no, this is too much. And there are people that are far more well versed on this subject than I am, that have really gotten to the nuts and bolts of the specific situation, the context around Russia's decision. But basically, they've said, you know, that the bullet point here is basically that Russia has acted pretty damn restrained, and not only in the sense of like how they've responded to this ongoing move east and the ongoing harassment by the US empire, but also in terms of what they're doing in Ukraine. And I'm not trying to say that war is ever nice or restrained, but Russia could have destroyed Ukraine in like a day.
That's true. And we see our carpet bombing, and we just like go in and like bomb. And there's no humane war. Like you're saying. There is a difference how we go in and do it than they go in and do it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what's really frightening is that when there were talks happening, I believe they were happening in Germany, already the U.S. media was saying how these talks will never work out between Putin and Zelensky, and it's like, war only ever ends one of two ways. One is genocide, where the other side basically just fucking dies. Or you sit down at a fucking table and you're like, hey, how can we make this war end? And the fact that US media and people in the US and in Sweden are like, oh, you can't sit down at a table with Putin. And I'm like, well, how the fuck do you expect this war to end? I don't understand. Like, you are saying that you don't want Ukrainians to die, and yet you're like, clearly they all have to die because you can't sit down at a table with Putin. I'm like, those are your only other fucking options. So you don't want Ukrainians to die, but you want them all to die because fuck sitting down at a table with Putin. What? Pick a lane.
He's like, to them, he's like devil incarnate, and they can't be in
God,
the same room with him.
If one more person compares Putin to Hitler, I'm going to lose my goddamn mind. And I'm not just saying that as a Jew either. Like, there was actually, this was one of my, it was Lloyd Blankfein who said, not even, first of all, Putin is not, there's no evidence to suggest that he's used chemical warfare. But then Lloyd Blankfein is like, not even Hitler used chemical warfare. And I'm like,
that's embarrassing.
What's a gas chamber, dude? And he also used it in like an actual like military offenses too. It wasn't just the gas chambers, and then you had like Rachel Maddow saying that like at least Hitler only never actually killed Germans. And I was like, okay, so I guess that the German Jews, Germans who were LGBTQ, Germans who were also Romani, they don't count as Germans. Like, you're literally just saying a fascist line and saying that Jews aren't Germans. You can't possibly be both. You can't possibly be gay and German at the same time. Like, wow.
We do that here though to ourselves. Like when Shireen Akleh was killed, they just keep calling her Palestinian, even though, and she is Palestinian. However, she's an American journalist too, but they just erase the fact that she's from here as well, and they just want it to seem like it's a Palestinian problem. And then chemical warfare that we did in like places like Vietnam or like just Korea, or Laos, where we just destroyed everything. And
for generations.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just hypocrisy.
Oh, of course. And again, I'm not saying that Putin is some fucking like leftist angel. He's an asshole. But let's be real, people. And also stay in your lane. Like, you have no right to tell the people of the Donbass region, whether they're Russian or Ukrainian, you have no right to topple the Ukrainian government in 2014 and install Nazis, like actual Nazis. Your job as the US is to focus on the fucking US, and to, as you know, as Americans who live there, our job is to tear down this empire. And the people of Russia can deal with Putin however they choose to, just like the people of Iran can deal with their government however they choose. Like, that's not our job. And as Eduardo Galeano, who's a Uruguayan writer, once said, anytime the US tries to save a country, they either turn it into a graveyard or an insane asylum. And I think that this is exactly the same thing that you see with NATO, which is basically just an extension of US empire. If you look at what NATO has done, they have only ever wreaked havoc. They have never protected their member states from an invasion, because no one's fucking invaded these countries. They have never protected their member countries from some kind of existential threat, because they are the existential threat. They are, and this is what's so sick about what people aren't understanding in Sweden in particular, and wanting to join NATO, is that you are pushing for world war. You are and Putin has said this too. It's like, he's been very honest. He's been like, don't fucking join NATO. I'm just telling you, like, don't do it. And which was really, I mean, I hate to say he has a point, but shit, that was the agreement when NATO was founded, that it wouldn't move east. And again, he's been restrained with the fact that both Sweden and Finland have allowed for NATO exercises to happen, like basically on the Russian border. Which, if you think about it from the opposite way, let's say that, like, Russia was doing exercises in Mexico. Do you think the US would be like, oh, that's cute? No, we'd fucking invade Mexico or some shit. Like, there would be such a harsh reaction. And yet we're trying to make it look like Russia had this atrocious reaction to what's been going on. And of course, not talking about how the US pushed them to do it. And that context is also missing in Sweden, because Sweden's job is now to lick the ass of US empire, and it's fucking disgusting. And as a Swede and as an American, I am horrified at how Sweden's acting, and just propping up US imperialism and pushing the world closer to world war. And I find it disgusting that I'm now counting on Erdogan to stop this from happening, because Turkey is part of NATO. And Erdogan has basically said, well, I don't think that we're going to vote to allow, because it has to be unanimous. I don't think we're going to allow Finland or Sweden to join NATO. And I'm like, am I honestly sitting here and cheering for Erdogan here? Not only that, but there was a speech that Henry Kissinger gave, who's now just a 99-year-old fucking ball of horror, who said, I don't think that, I think that this war needs to end, and I don't think these countries should join NATO. And I'm like, holy fuck, we've gotten to the point in this simulation where I'm agreeing with Henry Kissinger.
It's getting too close. It's getting too close for him. Like, and I think that's very important to highlight the fact that it's like NATO has allowed America to colonize a lot, like most of the European countries, so they can do whatever they have to do whatever we say to do. And the fact that I think the fact that the discourse even popped up about Sweden was because of Turkey being like, no, and everybody's like, Turkey's terrible for not letting Sweden into NATO. Sweden's always been nice, and
right. No. Yeah, no, it's really horrifying, because there's this, and I actually gave a speech about this at a protest in Stockholm yesterday, that there's a comfortability with ignorance and with the official story in Sweden, but I mean also in the US. But Sweden, the Swedes should really know a lot about NATO if they're so desperate to join. And they don't, if you mention, for instance, like what NATO did in Libya. What did NATO do in Libya? Oh, the fact that it's like a completely destroyed country now, and they're like slave markets now. No, like the understanding of what NATO is, and what it means to join NATO, they see it as a push for peace, which even just on its face, I don't see how joining a military organization can be considered a move for peace, like in general. But particularly in this context, it's horrifying. And the anti-war voices are very small in both Sweden and in the U.S. And it's really frustrating to see how Sweden is just going along with U.S. empire on this, and really pretty much anything else. And Sweden has a long history with Russia, and we've managed to like be relatively chill up until now, and it's like we're gonna let this all fall apart because of the U.S. And it's so frustrating to see as both a Swede and as an American. And so I really hope that we can get some pushback, both internally, but externally as well.
Well, Andrew, did you have anything else you want to ask Eleanor?
No, I think that you definitely covered a lot there. Yeah. And I realized too that we're approaching a little bit of the time, but yeah, thank you so much. This was really great information.
Yeah, that was awesome. I learned like so much, and I hope everybody out there learned a lot about Sweden that they did not historically know either, about the shadow that Sweden has that no one really knows about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say this. I think I realize I'm painting a picture, and people are like, "Oh, Jesus." Sweden is like, it's a beautiful place, and there are beautiful people here, and there is culture that is also beautiful. Kind of, I mean, it's like the U.S., right? And I think that that there's a lot to be said for, again, the work that's happening here in terms of fighting fascism and fighting war and fighting imperialism. That can only happen when you understand your history. And I think it's the same in the US, right? We can only understand where we're at when we see where we've been. It's like, I use the metaphor, like, let's say somebody drops you in the middle of the fucking woods. If you don't have a map, how do you know where you are? How do you know where you've been? The map is our history. It shows us, it allows us to locate ourselves in the history of humanity, in the history of geography as well. And figure out where we are and where we want to go. Like, how do we get out of the woods? How do we find our path? And we can't do that unless we understand history. And so I think that that's important for Swedes. It's important for folks in the US, and not just your own personal history, because as we look at history, we realize that there's so much interchanged, right? Obviously, like, the U.S. exists because of the slave trade. Sweden has a long history of imperialism and of colonizing and things like that as well. So we need to see history as a global human phenomenon and not just our own specific countries, because even Sweden hasn't been around that long in like the history of humanity. And so we have to do a better job of drawing those connections and finding ways that we can work in solidarity.
Thank you. And can you tell everybody where they can find you, and any projects or anything you have coming on in the future?
Yes, so people can find me at artkillingapathy.com. My film is up there, my music, poetry, articles, and things like that. I've been working specifically with Swedish organizing, specifically around NATO and things like that. But I'm working on a few like longer term projects, and working on raising a human being.
Awesome. Definitely understand that. Well, thank you, Eleanor, and hopefully we get to see you again. Come in for another history lesson or interview or whatever. The door's always open.
Awesome. Well, it's always good to hang with you all. So thank you for having me.
All right. Well, you have a great day.
You too. Cheers.
All right, everybody. Well, that was Eleanor Goldfield going over the history of Sweden for us. Hope everybody got a good history lesson there. So me and Andrew are going to be releasing it. Hopefully we'll have another stream tomorrow for you. So hopefully we'll probably be recording that tonight. And more than likely we'll have it out early for the patrons if they want to see it. So like, subscribe to the video, and also subscribe to our Patreon. We're on Twitch. Pretty much anywhere you can watch videos, as long as the government doesn't like start looking, or algorithm doesn't like what we're doing. And thank you all for watching. Thank you, Sula Moon. Thank you, Dingo Ate My Baby. And anybody else watching, y'all have a good one. Catherine Hamilton. Peace, guys. We'll see you later.
Peace.